Hello, can you identify who you are so I can know who is here? I am going to be sending out an email, so just be patient with me. I apologize for the delay. Can you hear me? Okay, so I'm going to be sending out an email to those who are on the list so that they can join. Oh, hi, Cece. It's good to see you. I haven't seen you in a while. Okay. So this might take a bit of time. My apologies, it's taking a bit of time because as we have to restart the live with a new link. And so what we are experiencing is this has not been automated. So I have to individually send, I have to individually send the link to those who actually signed up for the program. So we are going to be discussing worm farming and how you can get started and the benefits of worm farming. And we hope you will be patient with us as we try to contact those who actually registered for the course because this was supposed to be a private event, but because we're having technical difficulties and so we had to make changes. Times like this, it would be nice to have my assistant around. So, have you guys started worm farming or are you considering getting started in worm farming? What level are you at? And if you have any questions that you would like to ask at the end of the when we're doing the Q&A, then please make sure that you jot them down so that you don't forget your questions. Okay, now I know some of you are going to be leaving because this is taking too long, so I apologize and I will ensure that I send the link to you so that you can benefit from the program so you don't have to miss out because you put in all this effort to be here. So, again, I apologize for that. Just a few more and we'll be ready to go. Okay, let's see. Yeah, it would have been too late to get this automated. So, unfortunately, I have to be doing it individually, but we are almost there. Mhm. Two more to go, and we are ready to start. Okay, here we go. Again, I sincerely apologize for that. Oh, wow. That's quite a bit of your time that I took up there. I'm really sorry about that. After doing the test to ensure that everything is working properly, I still can't tell you what went wrong because based on the test, everything was going okay. So here we go. So I'm White Davy, and I'll be your host for today. And we are going to be discussing how to start a worm farm. And we're going to not show you just how to get started, but we're going to be sharing with you practical information such as how to maintain your worm, what type of conditions your worms are looking forward to, some of the benefits of worm farming, and how you can use your worm farm, your worm castings, how you can store your worm castings, things like that. And then at the end, we're going to have a Q&A. So if you have any questions, then please write them down if you think you might not remember them, or as the questions pop up in your head, just jot them down so that you'll remember them at the end of the discussion, and then we can answer your questions. And also, we are going to be doing the hands-on, showing you how to get that worm bin started. Okay, so first, what is worm farming? Before I explain what worm farming is, I'm just gonna give you a brief introduction into how I got started into this. And it was it was spring of 2016, March, and there I was standing outside in my garden looking at my compost pile. I had snow covering my winter boots, and I was thinking to myself, why do I have to do this? Every year, I have to turn compost twice per week for the entire spring, the entire summer, just so that I can wait one whole year before I have finished compost. I work full time in construction. Why do I have to come and do this? Mark you, I enjoy turning the compost, I enjoy gardening and everything, but it was just too much for me. And the worst part was waiting one whole year before I actually could see results. And so as I stood there in 2016 and I asked myself these questions, I decided, you know what? I'm going to go and do some research. And so I started researching how I can compost faster. Now, as I was doing the research, I saw something strange. Here, this document is saying vermicomposting. What is that? I've never heard of it. But based on what I heard, based on what I read, I could make compost a whole lot faster. And at that point, that is all I learned, that if I use worms, I could make castings, I could make compost faster. So I got excited and I started searching online to see if I could find a supplier. Thankfully, I did, but then she said, I'm sorry, we don't open until June. So I had to wait 3 months. But at the end of June, I got my worms, and that is how I get started. Now, as we go through the course, I'm going to be sharing with you more on this story because you're going to see how it relates to worm farming and why I think it is so important to share this information with others, with you. Okay, so what is worm farming? Worm farming is known as vermicomposting. It is not the same as composting, and the result that you get from it is not compost, but vermicompost, which is actually worm manure. Some call it worm manure. It is known as worm castings. It is known as vermicast or vermicompost. And it is where you feed your food scraps, your garden refuse, your yard waste, so your dried grass clippings, your dried leaves, all of these to your worms. Your worms will consume these matter. They break it down, and as they break it down, then the manure that comes from it, that is worm casting. And that process of taking the garden refuge, the kitchen scraps, and turning it into this beneficial black gold worm castings that you use in your garden, that is worm farming. Now, what are some of the benefits though of worm farming? I'm just going to read it off here because it would go a lot faster than me trying to remember all the benefits. So from what I have here, worm cast, some of the benefits. Environmentally, it reduces landfill waste. And by worms effectively breaking down food scraps and other organic matter, this organic matter that would normally go into the landfill now becomes now becomes something that you can use in your garden, and it is not no longer stored in your at the landfill. One, it also helped to mitigate climate change. It reduces landfill waste. It improves your soil. And that is one of the reasons why most of us get involved, because it improves the soil. And if you had worms directly to your soil, depending on the type of worms that you have, they will help to aerate your soil. It also enhances your soil structure, and it helps with water retention, where your soil will retain moisture, but it won't retain so much moisture that it becomes a problem for your plants. If you think about it, what the worms do, depending on the type of worms that you're getting, because there are three different types of worms. There are the worms that live deep down in the soil, and then there are those that just go horizontally in the soil below the surface of the soil. And then you have those that live on the surface of the soil. Now, the ones that live on the surface of the soil, these are your composting worms. There are some worms that travels up and down in your soil, and they go deep. They can go up to 10 feet down into your soil. Now, some of these, like the European night crawlers, the African night crawlers, the Canadian night crawlers, these are composting worms too. But not all the worms that go up and down in your soil are composting worms. The one that goes horizontally in your soil, those ones are not composting worms. Now, as these worms make their tunnel through the soil, what is happening is that they're creating the airflow in your soil, and they're creating the tunnels so that water can penetrate down into those tunnels. As the water goes down into those tunnels, then the roots that are deep in your soil is able to access moisture. Not only are they able to access moisture, but these worms that travels up and down, they take the food scraps down into their tunnels. And as they consume these food scraps and they break it down into the simplest form that your plants can absorb, what happens is that now the plant roots that are deep are able to access all of these nutrients that are down there. Now, your soil contains certain minerals that is not really found in the upper layer of your soil. So when these worms create these tunnels, the root of the plants can travel in these tunnels and access those minerals that are down in the soil. So these are some of the benefits. Now, also, have you ever tried sowing seeds and they take forever to germinate, or the rate of germination is really poor? Well, here is one more benefit of worm farming. When you use worm castings in your seedling mix, or if you're sowing directly in the soil, if you had worm castings, then it speeds up germination. And not only that, but it strengthens the roots of your plants, seedlings and large plants, excuse me, so that these plants are stronger. And not only are they stronger, worm castings help your plants to avoid attack from certain pests and certain pathogens. And not only do they do that, but the castings also make your plants grow faster. And even the very taste of your produce is enhanced when you had worm castings to your garden. Now, let's look at how you can care for your worms. Now, I like to call this the P fast of worm farming. So it is the letter P and the word fast of worm farming. And this P fast stands for the five things, the five things that worms need. So what are they? The P stands for the pH, meaning the level of acidity or the alkalinity in your worm bin. So what is it really? The pH that worms require, the pH that is best for your worms, range between 6 and 7. Worms cannot stand acidic conditions. It burns their skin, it disrupt their respiratory system, and so it is harmful to worms if your worm bin is acidic. And we're going to be discussing more on this as we go along. Now, the next one is food. So, what type of food do your worms eat? Worms will eat anything that is organic. So, whether it is kitchen scraps, whether it is meat, whether it is garden waste, whether it is shredded paper, shredded cardboard, they will eat anything that is organic. But while they will eat anything that is organic, there are some foods that you have to be mindful of if you're considering to feed it to your worms. And what are these foods? Some of them are bad not because it is harmful to your worms, but because of the problem that it creates, not for the worms, but for you. So, so then some of those foods that are harmful that you don't want to feed your worms would include things like dairy products and meat. While the worms love these, you have two problems that can result from feeding to meat and dairies to your worms. One, it will attract pests, and you don't want things like roaches and rats in your worm bin, and especially if you're keeping it in your home. Two, they if the worms cannot process it fast enough, like within a day, what is going to happen is that those foods are going to break down and they're going to get smelly. Now, when those get smelly, the first point that we discuss is going to take effect. It's going to attract more pests, and that is what you do not want. Now, we said we'll discuss more about pH, and this is where food is concerned, and even moisture, and we're going to get to that later on. So, certain foods are acidic, like pineapple, oranges are members of the allium family, not just oranges, but any member of the citrus family. These are acidic in nature, and so they can be harmful to your worms. Your worms will eat them. They will eat the onion. You will find a lot of them in the onions if you put a whole onion in the bin. So they will eat the acidic food. But what happens is that if there is too much of it in the bin, then the entire bin becomes acidic. When there is a small quantity of it, what will happen is that the worms will eat it. But then if the environment is too acidic for them, they have somewhere else in the bin that they can go. But if the bin is if the bin has a lot of acidic food in it, then there is nowhere for the worms to escape. So some will tell you, do not feed acidic food to your worms. And I will say to you, it is a matter of knowing how much you can feed to your worms. So use moderation if you're going to be feeding acidic foods to your worms. Now, we've looked at pH, and we had looked at foods. Now, one more thing to consider. Tell me, do you think worms have teeth? Composting worms do not have teeth. They have gizzards just like birds. And so worms will take long to break down certain foods or any food that you put into the worm bin. When I had my first workshop, one of in-person workshop, one of the clients, I ran into her one day and I asked her, "How are your worms?" And she said, "Oh, the worms were taking so long to eat the food that I just take them and throw them out in my garden because they weren't producing the eating the food fast enough." So I said to her, and I'm sharing this story because you might have the same experience, and I just want you to understand what is happening so that you don't get frustrated or so that you don't think that the worms are not actually doing their work. What happened is that worms don't have teeth, and so they cannot chew the food. And when you put things like lettuce, not lettuce, 'cause lettuce has a lot of moisture content, which means that it breaks down quickly. But things like cabbages, members of the brassica family, so cabbages, kale, pak choi, those sort of things that take a bit of time to break down. or any other food scraps for that matter, because the worms don't have teeth, they rely on the microbes that are in the bin to break them down. Now, when you're just starting a worm bin, depending on what you're starting with, there might not be a lot of microbes or any microbes in your worm bin for that matter. The worms are going to eat the microbes, and they're going to eat the food scraps, and they're going to eat the bedding that are in the worm bin. But initially, the worms are going to be relying on the microbes for food. They're relying on the microbes to eat the microbes, and they're relying on the microbes to break down the food scraps so that they can consume what is left after the microbes have broken it down. So, with that in mind, then, when you are just getting started, you will notice that the worms are not consuming as fast as you expect them to. Now, it is said that worms can eat up to their full or half their body weight in a day. That is the case if all the five conditions, so the P fast, which is pH, food, airflow, space, and the temperature, if these five conditions are met and they are consistent and the microbes are present, then your worms will process the food fast. They will eat up to their body weight or half their body weight in a day if all these five conditions are maintained. Now, we are living in the real world. The chances of all those five conditions being met at all times is highly unlikely unless you have a room dedicated to them that you can control the temperature, the airflow, and all those things. Then, yes, you will see that result. But in general, you won't be getting that result if all those conditions are not met. So, when it comes to feeding your worms, then it is important that you pay attention to how much your worms are eating. So start off by feeding a small amount. Watch how fast or how slow they finish it, and that will tell you whether you need to give them more food or whether you need to give them less food. Okay, so with that in mind, then let's look at airflow. This is very important. Do you know how worms breathe? Worms breathe through their skin. They don't have nose like you and I do. So they breathe through their skin. And that is why it is important then that they have good airflow in the worm bin, because those oxygen particles get absorbed into their skin and then get taken to their bloodstreams. So if the bin is not does not have enough air, then it can be a problem to your worms. And sometimes you will find your worms escaping from the bin because it does not have enough airflow. So when you are maintaining your bin, then it is important that every time that you're looking after your worms, you aerate the bin. So by aerating, it means you go in and you turn the content of the bin, right? It is also important. Now, some of you, when you are worm farming, you are going to be buying worm bins, like those stackable bins, or you might decide that you want to make your own worm bin. If you want to make your own worm bins, it is important that can you see this? Can you see those holes in the bin? So the bin need holes in the side. The bin need holes in the cover. Now you might notice that on mine, I have a screen there, and that is to help reduce the amount of fruit flies or other pests that can get in. Now, if you are going to be making your own worm bin and you intend to put holes in there, some people will tell you they put 5 inch, half-inch holes, but I would say it is best to put quarter-inch holes and smaller in your worm bin as opposed to the larger holes. Why? For pest control. Things like rodents, I know mice, can make themselves so small that if the hole is anything larger than quarter-inch, they can get into your worm bin. So I say put more holes and make them quarter-inch, but don't make them too big. Now, even with the screen on the bin, Those mice and other rodents can bite through the screen, especially if the holes is big. When the holes are smaller, it's harder for them to bite through the screen to get to your worms. Okay, so airflow is very important to worm farming, to your worms. And then that brings us to the next one, which is space. So let me tell you a little story about it. I won't take long. I know we have already gone way over time because of the delay. Now, when I first started my worm farm, the lady I got the worms from said, you know, within 3 months, your worms are going to double their population. And I got excited. But then 2.5 months later, I decided I have to harvest these worms because they were in my compost bin outside. Remember that compost bin I mentioned at the start of the discussion? My compost bin is made of pallet. It was 4 feet wide, 4 feet high, 4 feet deep. And it was full when I put the worms in there. Now, when it was time to harvest the worms, did I have double the population? What do you think? No, I didn't have double the population. After harvesting, you want to guess how much I had? 20 pounds of worms in 2.5 months. I was so excited. You can just imagine. I was so excited. So I harvested them, and I was in Saskatchewan, so it was getting cold. It was around September. So I harvested them and I brought them indoors, and I bought two 76-liter totes, and I divide the worms 10 pounds per tote, and I put them in my basement. I was so happy. I took pictures of it. I did a video of it and I showed it to the lady who I bought the worms from. But there is one thing that I didn't know, and that cost me dearly. And I learned my lesson quite well. And that brings us to the next thing that worms require, and that is space. Now, worms require a lot of space. And when the worms don't have enough space, what happens is that your worms are going to try to escape the bin. The adult ones are going to escape the bins and leave the baby ones so that they can thrive. Now, I didn't know that when I harvested my worms. And so, what I did was divide the 20 pounds of worms into two parts, 10 pounds each. There was no bedding in there because I didn't know anything about bedding at that point in time. So there was no bedding in there. There wasn't anything in there more than the worms. And then I put the food that I am feeding them, and that's it. So every time I go in the rooms where the worms are, I would notice that there are quite a few dead worms on the floor. In a few months, that 20 pounds of worms became 4 pounds of worms. I lost 16 pounds of worms just because I didn't know that worms require a lot of space. Now, did I have a lot of space in that bin? Yes, I had enough space that it could maintain those worms. But when you think of space, you might just think about the size of the container that you're using. But it's not just about the size of the container, because if you have a container like this, the worms are going to be only where there is material in the bin. So if I should take out most of this material, the worms are just going to be found with whatever volume of material I have in here. Whereas if I had the more material I have, the more the worms can spread out. The more space worms have, the more they eat, the more they reproduce. Because when worms realize that their space is limited, they're going to slow down their rate of production. Whether it is their reproduction or the rate at which they're eating, they're going to slow down to control their population. So, and that is the same for food as well. If they don't have enough food, they are going to be reducing the rate at which they reproduce. Okay, so then space is very important to your worms. And now that brings us to the last part, and it's very important. And in these days, it is becoming more and more important with climatic changes, and that is the temperature in your worm bin. So When it comes to worms, they can composting worms. You have some of the worms that are good for warm weather, and there are those that are good for cool weather, and there's those that can tolerate both hot and cold. So the worms that can tolerate heat would be your Indiana blue worms and your African night crawlers. The worms that tolerate cold is the Canadian night crawlers, but Canadian night crawlers are not very good composting worms. Now, red wrigglers and European night crawlers, these two are the best among composting worms. They're prolific breeders and they're ferocious eaters, and they can survive a wide range of temperature swings. Now, you notice I've been talking about pH and temperatures and airflow and all of that, but I have not been giving you the information that you need in terms of how much moisture, how much, what temperature range. So for moisture, for your worms, you want to have a 60 to 80% moisture content. So when it comes to moisture, if you want to know how much moisture, if your bin has enough moisture or too little, then what you want to do is a squeeze test. And so what you do here is you take the bedding. So if you're not at your desk and you're just listening, you might want to pay attention to the screen because I'm going to be demonstrating what a squeeze test is. Okay, so the squeeze test is when you take the content of your worm bin and you give it a squeeze. Are you seeing that? You're seeing those drops, right? You want to see 2 to 4 drops of water coming out, and then you know you have 60 to 80% moisture content in your burn bin, and that is okay. Now, if you see water running or a lot of drops coming out when you do that gentle squeeze, then it is an indication that your bin is too moist. And so, what you can do is remove the cover from the bin and allow natural airflow to take place, aerate the bin so that more air can circulate through it, fluff it up, or you can add more bedding to your material. Now, what is bedding? Bedding is any organic matter that is carbon based. So, when it comes to feeding your worms, there are two types of food scraps that you want to add to your worm bin, and that is carbon based products known as browns, and then there is the nitrogen based products known as greens. So, those are the two things that you use to create a balanced diet between your worm, a balanced diet for your worms. So, your browns or your carbon based material would be things like dried grass clippings. And notice I said dried. If it is not dry, then it is a nitrogen source. If it is dried, then it becomes a carbon source. So, dried leaves, dried grass clippings, shredded paper, shredded cardboard, and you want the ones that are not printed or colored, and things like cocoa coir, peat moss, those type of things, those are browns. Your greens or your nitrogen ones would be the food scraps that you're feeding your worm, the plant leaves that are green. So the garden refuse, maybe you harvest your lettuce and there's some of the plant remaining, and you're going to be throwing that in your compost pile that can be fed to your worm, and that is your greens or your nitrogen based food. Now, I think at this point I should make it clear because a lot of time we hear about worm castings and we hear about the benefit of worm castings and we say, okay, yes, I'm going to raise worms now. I'm going to raise worm because I want these benefits. But there is two important factors that you need to consider when it comes to raising worms. And that is, what are you growing? Are you growing trees and shrubs? Or are you growing vegetables and fruits? Now, if you're growing trees and shrubs, then you want your worm castings to be more fungal dominant. If you want your worm castings for trees to be fungal dominant, then what you do is add far more browns or carbon based material than you do nitrogen material. If you're growing vegetables and fruits and flowers, then you want a nitrogen rich castings, which is going to be bacterial dominant. So in that case, then you're going to be adding more food scraps. And if you want to strike the balance, because sometimes you can balance it, so it is recommended that every time you feed your worms, you had 1 part food to 2 parts bedding. And again, your bedding would be things like cocoa coir, peat moss, your shredded paper, shredded cardboard, dried leaves, dried grass clippings. Those are your bedding. Now, you can feed your worms things like manure, but it has to be composted, because if it's not composted, it can heat up your worm bin. It gets too hot and it will harm your worms. So, if you want to make it fungal dominant, you're not going to do 1 part nitrogen or 1 part, um, yes, brown greens to 2 parts brown. So it's not nitrogen to carbon 1 to 2. What you want to do is like 1 part nitrogen, and you have 10 parts carbon. You can have 25 parts, 30 parts, you can have 50 parts carbon if you are going for fungal dominant for trees and shrubs. But if you're going bacterial dominant, then you want to have 1 part nitrogen or greens to 2 parts of browns. Okay, so now that we have looked at that, are you ready, guys? Are you ready to start that worm bin? For those of you who actually signed up for the course, you would have gotten a list of things that you would need to get to start that hands-on practice of starting your worm bin. So let's get into that. Just got to move this out of the way a bit. Okay, here we go. So we are going to be starting a worm bin. So in here we have the small bin, and we already have some shredded paper. And what you're going to be doing is you're going to take your shredded cardboard or whatever type of bedding you decide you want to use, and you're going to pour water on it in a container, not in the one you're going to be using for the worm bin. And when you have done that, you're going to allow it to soak for a bit, and then you're going to take the material and you're going to squeeze out the liquid. Now, if you're using things like cocoa coir or peat moss, those have small particles. So taking it up like this and squeezing it out might not work for you because the particles are small. So in that case, you could get an old t-shirt or something, put the bedding in there and wring it out until you have the consistency where you're only seeing 2 to 3 drops, maybe 4 drops coming out. Okay, so once you have done that, what you want to do is, if you are starting the worm bin for the first time and you're using things like the shredded cardboard that doesn't have any microbes or anything in there, inoculating your bin is a good practice. And when I say inoculate your bin, what it means is that you get the bin, you moisten the bedding, and you allow it to sit for a week or two so that the microbe populations can start growing in there before you add your worms. Now, you can always add your worms immediately, it won't do them any harm. But if you know you're going to be purchasing worms, then starting the bin, no food scraps, just the bedding, moisten and allow to sit for a while. If you have things, you can add a tablespoon of soil. If you have compost, you can add a little compost. If you have anything that has microbes in it, you can add a bit of that to it, because that is going to speed up the growth of the microbe population, so that when the worms are placed in there, they have food to eat right away that is readily available. So once you have done this? Are you there yet? Have you moistened your bedding and had it to your bin yet? Okay, the next step then is to add your worms. Make sure you do that squeeze test to ensure that you see 2 to 3 drops coming out, but not running. If it is runny, then it means you need to add more bedding, and the bedding will absorb the extra moisture. So next is to add your worms. Now, I mentioned feeding acidic food to your worms, and oranges, members of the citrus family, are acidic. This part of the orange, however, that doesn't have the skin on it, nor the fleshy part of the orange, the juicy part of the orange. This is okay for your worms. You can feed any amount of this part to your worms. Now, this takes quite a bit of time to break down. Now, the other thing too that I should have mentioned is that if you want to speed up the process, especially when you're just starting the worm bin and you know that the food is firm and it is hard for the worms to break down, and you don't want to wait for the worms to take long to process it. Take the food scraps that you intend to feed them initially, put it in your freezer, freeze it, and then thaw it out. Once you do that, it will rupture the cells of the food scraps, making it soft and easy for the worms to consume. So here we have some European night crawlers. Look at these babies. And you just simply rest them on the surface of the bin. As you rest them on the surface of the bin, they don't like light, and so they are going to try to go down. European night crawlers are finicky worms, though. They don't like to be disturbed. And so what happens is some of them will try to escape. And when you get worms, when you purchase worms and they're in a new environment for the first time, they will move about quite a bit, and they will try to, sometimes they will try to escape the bins, other times they are quite fine. Now, if your bin is damp or sweaty on the sides or the cover, you will notice that there are worms on it, because wherever moisture is, worms are going to be there. So if you see just a few worms on the side of your bin or on the cover of your bin, it is no problem. If you see a mass exodus of worms, though, then you need to be concerned, because it means that there is something wrong with your bin. Now, starting a worm bin is as simple as this. You saw that, just had the bedding, and if you want to wait a week or two to inoculate, then fine. And then you just simply had your worms. So starting a worm bin, there's nothing complicated about it. The important part is the maintenance. So you want to avoid things. There are common mistakes that worm farmers make, especially when they're just getting started. And some of that common mistake is to make their bins too wet or too dry. Now, if your bin is too wet or too dry, when your bin is too dry, the worms cannot breathe. So we mentioned that they need moisture, but the moisture that the worms get is also, they're able to absorb it through their skin if their skin is moist. If their skin is dry, they cannot absorb it. And so what that is going to do is restrict the amount of airflow that these worms can get, and that will result in them dying, and you don't want that. So if your bin is too dry, add enough moisture. If Add more moisture. If it is too wet, then add more shredded cardboard, open the bin, put a fan in the room, but not directly on the bin, because you don't want that fast drying. That could be harmful to your worms as well. So put a fan to circulate in the room, but not directly on your worms. So that is what you do if your bin is too wet. Or you can take the content of the bin, spread it out into a larger bin, and allow it to be there for a while until you see the moisture level normalized. Now, next issue that you young ones or new worm farmers tend to have is overfeeding their worms. You know, you are happy you are producing all of these food scraps and you just want to see the worms eating it up and turning it into castings. And so you just, every time you have food scraps, you go in there and you feed the worms. But worms can only eat so much at a time. And if you overfeed them, the problems that you're going to have is because they cannot eat the food fast enough, then one, it's going to become anaerobic. And if it becomes anaerobic and smelly in the bin, it means that your bin is going to become acidic, which, as we discussed before, is harmful to the worms. So then you don't want that to happen. So try not to overfeed them again. You feed a small amount. You watch how long it takes. Did it take them a day? Did it take them a week? Did it take them more than a week to eat it? If they're taking more than a week to eat the food scraps you give them, it means you're feeding them too much. So monitor how much they eat and then either increase or decrease based on their rate of consumption. Now, another concern that people have is that they tend to forget about their worms. When you're just getting started, it is something new to you and you have a busy schedule. And so it's not easy to remember about your worms. In that case, what you can do is you go in your kitchen every day or you go to the washroom every day, right? So just put a little sign somewhere where you know you have to go multiple times for the day. Or if you're someone who create a to-do list or a schedule, then you just put it on your schedule and you know that, okay, every Saturday at 1 p.m. Okay, I am going to go and look after my worms. When you have it on a schedule or you have it on your fridge or in the washroom, or every time you sit down to use the washroom, you see the note, feed the worms, and you know that once you get up, once you leave that kitchen, once you use that washroom, once wherever you have that note, once you look in that book and you see, okay, today this is what I have scheduled, you ensure that you do it. Don't put it off. It is one of those things that you must do. Now, if you forget to feed your worm one day or for 1 week, your worms are not going to die, and the worms eat the bedding too, so you want to make sure that you have bedding in there. And then another concern that a lot of people have, especially here in Canada, is that Canada and the US, a lot of people just love traveling. And when summer comes, they're gone for a month or they might be gone for 6 weeks and they're concerned about their worms. What happened to my worms if I leave? Now, what I always recommend is if you are going to be going on vacation, increasing the amount of food scraps you feed your worms is not practical. And it's not practical because the worms cannot consume it fast enough and it's going to be anaerobic, and then it can cause other issues, pests or acidic conditions that harms your worms, things like that. But what you can do is add more bedding, because you see your bedding is not something that is going to be smelly and attracting rodents and stuff like that. So add more bedding, any amount of bedding you can add. If you know you're going to be gone for a very long time, add more bedding, top up the bed, and a little bit more moisture than you would normally add to your worm bin. You had a little bit more moisture, that will keep them going. Worms are quite resilient, so they won't just die suddenly if for 1 week you cannot feed them or for a month you cannot feed them. As long as they have moisture and they have bedding, then they should be fine. Okay, so don't hold back from going on your vacation, or don't hold back from starting that worm bin because you go on vacation. And now, if you're someone who goes on vacation like quite frequently, maybe 5, 6, 7 times for the month, sorry, not the month, but the year, then you might want to think seriously about worm farming, because these conditions, when you go on vacation, it can add a little stress to your worms if you are there for too long. So think about it carefully and make adjustment based on what you think is required. Now, in your worm bin, there are certain things that people get concerned about. Sometimes you need to be, sometimes you don't need to be. So you'll find insects in your worm bin. That is commonplace. There's nothing you can do about that. As long as you have a worm bin, there are going to be insects in there. There are good insects that are beneficial and there are bad ones. Now, some of the good ones would be things like centipedes or potworms, and a lot of people see potworms in their bin. I'm one of them. When I, the first year that I had my, when I started worm farming, I was so happy. I was harvesting the castings, the first harvest. And believe me, I am not kidding you when I said I had 2 pounds of baby worms. I was so excited. I took a video of it and I'm like, oh, look at all these babies. But guess what? They were not baby worms at all. They were pot worms. So a lot of you, when you get started, you're going to you might see these guys and you might think to yourself, okay, yes, here the worms are reproducing. Here's a lot of babies. But the difference, how you identify baby composting worms from pot worms, is that pot worms are white. They're slender, all a little bit thicker than thread, and they're usually about half to 3/4 inch in length. They don't go taller than that. The baby composting worms, however, these ones are pinkish in color. After the first 8 hours after their cocoons hatch, they will gain their rightful color, but they're usually pinkish in nature. So if you see white and you see pink baby worms, the white ones are pot worms. They are not harmful to your worm bin. They are composting worms. They're composters. Now, why can it be a concern though if you do see a lot of potworms? If you see a few potworms in your bin, it is okay. Now, when you see a lot of potworms in your bin, it indicates one of two things or both. One, your bin is acidic because potworms thrive in acidic condition, or your bin is too moist and they thrive when there's a lot of moisture. So if that is the case, then what you can do if you see a lot of them is to dry out your bin and to add things like garden lime or diatomaceous earth or crushed eggshell. Now, as we mentioned crushed eggshell, and I mentioned before that your worms do not have teeth, one of the ways that you can help your worms to digest their food faster so that they can keep eating is by adding grit to your worm bin. So grit like crushed eggshell or crushed oyster shell can be added, just a small sprinkle of it. Now, coffee grounds can also be added to your worm bin, but in small amount because it is rich in nitrogen and it can harm your worms if you put too much in there and the bin heats up. Now, mites. There are some mites that are, all mites are composters, but most of the mites that you see in your worm bin, you will see white, and you will see two different type of white mites. There's one that moves fast and there's one that looks like eggs, like tiny little eggs, and they don't seem to be moving, but they are moving. Now, if you see mites in your worm bin, there's also brown mites and there are red mites. If you see brown or any of the white mites in your worm bin, that is okay. Now, they like similar condition to the potworm. So if you see a large population of them, then it means that your worm bin is too moist or too acidic. And the steps that I mentioned for the potworms, you'd use the same steps to control the mites. Or you can take a piece of bread, soak it in milk, put it on the surface of the bin on top of the bedding, and the mites and the potworms will go on it. You take that out, you throw it out, and you repeat the process until you're satisfied with the amount of mites or potworms that remain in the bin. Now, if you see red mites in your bin, then you need to be concerned because they bite your worms and they bite you too. And those are the buggers, they are so fast. Oh my gosh, you will look and you see them on crawling on the sides of your bin. And by the time you dip your hand in the bin, you start to feel things crawling up and biting you all over. They are very fast and they're annoying. So if you find that you have red mites, you might want to get rid of them as quickly as possible or at least control the population. Now, these things are hard to get rid of. And it does not take much. I don't know where they come from, because even if you don't use yard debris, once the condition in your bin is too acidic or too wet, they just appear out of nowhere. Okay, so that takes care of that. Now, some of the harmful things, you don't want mice or rodents of any sort in your worm bin, because they will eat your worms. You don't want roaches in there, because they will spread to your property and inside your homes and things like that. And centipede. Now, millipedes in your worm bin are fine. They don't harm your worms, but centipedes will eat your worms. So if you have centipedes, then you need to find some way to get rid of them, restart the bin if you have to. And slugs and snails, while they don't harm your worms, they compete for the food, and they will lay their eggs in your castings. And when you put the castings in your garden, it becomes a problem, because they decimate your garden. So for that reason, snails and slugs you do not want in your worm bin. These are just some of the most common pests. Some people have problems with lizard going in their worm bins and eating the worms. Now, I don't live where there are lizards, so I couldn't tell you how to deal with that. But if you see a lizard in your worm bin, you need to get rid of it quickly. Okay. Now let's look at harvesting castings, because this is one of the concerns that a lot of people have. And there are many ways that you can harvest castings. So there is the sifting, and some people are concerned that when they sift, it will harm the worms. It does not really harm your worms when you sift your castings. So you can sift, and for sifting, some people use quarter-inch screen. I use 1/8. I don't use the quarter-inch screen, because some of the unprocessed material will make it through the screen if I use the quarter-inch. But if you're a gardener, it doesn't really matter much. But for me, because I do this as a business and I'm selling my castings, then I want that quarter-inch where I can control what goes through that sifter. Now, when you have sifted your worms, no matter how good you are at sifting or what method you had, if you're going to have cocoons and you're going to have worms, especially baby ones that make it through the sifter, that is okay. Now, if you want to save those cocoons or those worms that make it through the sifter, if you want to put them back into your worm bin, harvesting the cocoon is either a very expensive machine to do so, or you handpick them, which is not very practical. You could be there for days. So what is recommended is that you get a cup with holes in the bottom and the sides, and you put food scraps and bedding in that cup, and you just feed in the cup, put it in the harvested castings, and the worms will go in there, and the cocoons will hatch and go to wherever the food and the moisture is. And then you, every 2 weeks, you take that out and you keep replacing until you're satisfied. So sifting. Now there is also what we call the light method, where, and the light method is similar to the method that I call agitate, where on the top of your bin, you just simply disturb the top here, and the worms don't like to be disturbed. So when you do this, once they feel you disturbing the surface of the bin, they start moving down. Can you see the paper moving there? Because the worm is trying to escape the moment he realizes I'm disturbing the bin. Yes, so once you disturb the bin, the worms start to move down. And as they move down, you scrape off the upper layer, and you just keep repeating that process. It's the same thing for the light method. Worms don't like light because it paralyzes them. So if you're starting a worm bin for the first time and you notice your worms trying to escape, put a light over the bin, and not too close, because the light will paralyze them. It will dry them out, and after 1 hour, the worms will die. So don't put it too close, and don't make sure that the light is not too hot either. So that is what you're going to do. You put the light over the bin, the worms are going to dive down because they're trying to escape from the light. You scrape off the upper surface until you start to see worms. Once you start to see worms, you stop, put back the light, or agitate the top of the bin again and let the worms move down, and you keep repeating that process until you have harvested the castings. Now, there's one thing I need to mention when it comes to using the sifter to harvest your castings, however, it is very important that when you are shaking that sifter, you don't try to get every bit of castings out of it, because you're going to end up with more particles that are not castings. And not only that, it is going to be too much for your worms. So once, go through the sifting once, don't do it the second time. And then the material that remains in the sifter, you put that to restart your worm bin, and you keep repeating that process until the harvest is complete. Okay, so those, and then the next method is the horizontal migration. For the horizontal migration, what happens, how you do it is, you take all of the unfinished material, so all of those big food scraps and bedding material, you want to take those and you want to move them to one side of the bin. And then for the castings, you move it to the other side of the bin. As you separate the castings from the food scraps and the bedding, what is going, you're going to stop watering or moistening the section where the casting is. What you're going to be moistening is a section where the bedding is. And every time you feed where the bedding is. When you feed where the bedding is and you had the moisture there, this is going to be moist. This is going to be not so moist. So most, not all of the worms are going to migrate to wherever the food and the moisture is. And then as they migrate over there, then you can harvest your castings. Now, some worms are going to remain in the castings. There's nothing you can do about that. You can either unpick them or sift them out if you want to, but there will always be worms and cocoons in the castings that you have harvested. So that is okay. And then whatever material is left, the unprocessed material, you use that to restart your bin. So this is how the horizontal migration work. Now, of all the methods of harvesting, the horizontal migration put the worms under the least amount of stress, but it is the one that takes the most time, because it can take weeks for most of the worms to move over to where the food scrap is. But if you are someone who is concerned about the safety of your worms and you don't want to stress your worms too much, then the horizontal migration is the safest method for them. All of the methods are okay, but the safest is the horizontal migration. Now, one concern that a lot of those who attend my workshop tend to raise is that it is so much information to remember. So some are taking notes, and if you're like me, you're taking notes, and every time you hear something really important that you think you need to remember, you jot it down. But while the person is speaking, you miss some of the information that was delivered. And so they're concerned that they won't remember everything. It is challenging. And they're afraid that, you know what, if I start my worm bin, I'm still going to have issues because I didn't hear everything or I didn't get notes on everything. That is quite understandable. And so if that is the case, or if you're going along in your worm farming journey and you find that you're having difficulty with it, there are questions, there are issues that arise that you weren't anticipating, you don't know how to deal with, then I have a community where we teach more about worm farming and gardening. We guide you along the week. Every week we have discussion, we have courses, we have a monthly live discussion to help you to become more proficient at gardening, more proficient at worm farming. So I'm going to be leaving a link for you in the description that you can use to join this community so that you can reap the benefits of both gardening and worm farming. Now, this is one of the only communities that you can find where it combines gardening and worm farming. And this community, what I like about it is that not only does it combine gardening and worm farming, but what it does is go deep into these topics, because the goal is to ensure that each family can provide food for their families, whether or not they have to deal with climatic conditions or they have to deal with poor economic conditions that is ever fluctuating. Then this community is there to help you. And then when you face challenges and you have to do it on your own, it can be so difficult. So I know some of you are going to be leaving as you hear me discussing this because it's not really worm farming, but stay tuned. We have more to discuss on the worm farming topic, so don't leave yet. Yes, but this community, you can talk to your fellow like minded individuals, share ideas, ask questions, and learn from each other. We don't hold back information. Like a lot of people hold back information because they think if they do, they're going to be missing out. But sharing what you know is the best way to help not just others, but to help yourself. So feel free to join our community because trust me, it will be worth your effort. And I'm going to be putting the link for that community in the description below. Okay, so now, how do you use worm castings for the best benefit? Now, I've done some experiments and I've seen others done similar experiments with worm casting to see how much worm casting should we really be using to get the best result. So, based on the experiment, we have used 5% worm casting to the soil. So, for example, say you're starting a container garden and you know that you're going to be using 4-part soil. You want to have 1 part castings, 4-part soil, and that would be 20% worm castings. And when you have 20% worm casting, that is where you get the best results. So 1 part castings, 4-part soil. That gives you the best result. Now, I know worm casting is very expensive, which is why you're here too, because if you start your home worm farm, you don't have to buy castings. You might have to buy casting within the first year or the first 6 months of you starting a worm farm. But after that, oh, look at you just flying, producing all that castings, and your plants, your garden is doing so well, and you don't have to pay the expensive because worm casting is expensive. So I know that 20% worm castings is not easy to come by. But if you don't have 20% worm casting, you can still add the whatever amount you have to your garden because your garden is still going to be benefiting. Because one of the ways that worm castings benefit your garden is that worm casting is not focused on nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium like regular fertilizer. And because of it is not recognized legally as a fertilizer, but as a supplement. But that is only on a commercial level. It is that is created out of the greedy commercial system. Because if you go online or in the dictionary and you look up the meaning of fertilizer, it means anything that helps plants to grow, right? So when you use worm casting, it is helping your plants to absorb the nutrients and grow. So really it is a fertilizer, but because it is not something that is manufactured by mankind and they can't put a patent on it and they can't commercialize it in the same way that they would with man-made fertilizer, and so they do not list it as a fertilizer, which is pitiful. But anyway, worm casting works because what it does, it contains nutrients, it contains NPK in very small amount, depending on what stage you harvest it at. So, for example, if you are worm farming and you harvest your castings before it is fully ready to be harvested, what you're going to have is compost and casting combined. There you have your fertilizer. If you if you harvest it when it is castings, mostly castings, then it will have a small amount of NPK, but it will have minerals and other nutrients that your plants need. And in addition to that, because it is so loaded with microbes, 1 tablespoon of worm casting have millions of microbes. What the microbes do is that they break down the food scraps, the nutrients in the soil, into the simplest form that the plants can absorb. And as they break down the nutrients into the simplest plant form for the plants to absorb, the plants can absorb it faster than when you put regular fertilizer, whether organic or man-made. The plants can absorb it a whole lot faster. Now, worm casting slowly releases it. So when it does that, it lasts for a long period of time. When you put worm castings in your soil, it lasts for 2 months. So over 2 months, the castings slowly releases its benefits into the soil. Now, one other way that you can use worm castings apart from directly using the worm casting is to make worm tea. Now, when you make a worm tea, the advantage of it is that the nutrients and the microbes are readily available in the tea. You can use it as to water your plant, or you can use it as a foliar spray. So if you have pests like aphids and whiteflies and mites, you make your worm tea and you spray your plants as a foliar spray, and that will help to control these. Or if you have certain plant pathogens like fusariums and those, then you can use that to spray the plants as well. Now, when you're using worm castings in your soil, now some people might say, okay, how do I measure 20% when I'm planting in a raised bed or in the ground and not in container? It's simple. Most of the plants that you grow will be grown in 6 to 10 to 12 inches of soil. If you know that you're planting in, say, 12 inches of soil or 10 inches of soil, what you want is to divide the number of inches into 5 parts. 4 parts of it is going to be soil and 1 part of it is going to be castings. So if you're planting in 10 inches of soil then and you divide it by 5, it means that 2 inches of your soil, you should have 2 inches of worm casting to the soil and mix it into the surface of the soil. Now, some people top dress with worm castings. I say don't. And if you're going to be top dressing with worm castings, it is important that you, the first 2 inches of the soil at least, or 3 inches of the soil, you mix it into the soil. Why is that so important? Because your soil, the worm castings, is only viable if it is moist. Just like the worms need moisture, your castings need moisture because the microbes require air and moisture, just like your worm. Less amount of moisture, but they still require moisture and air. So, what you want to do then is make sure that your castings stay moist. If you put it on the surface of the soil, where is the first part of your garden that dries out? The surface of the soil, right? So in that case, then what you want to do is mix it into the top few inches of your soil so that it is in among the dirt and other material that you have there so that it does not dry out quickly. Now, when you're planting, you and each if you're transplanting, as you dig your holes, you can add your worm castings to it, or before you plant, you can, if you till your soil, you can just till it into the soil, or again, you can top dress using the method I just mentioned. So those are some of the ways that you apply worm castings. Okay, so now we have come to the end of the discussion, and you guys might have questions. So, do you have any questions that you would like to ask? And sometimes you will hear people say, I have a stupid question to ask. There is no such thing as a stupid question. The stupid questions are the ones you don't ask. If you don't ask it, it is stupid because you can't get an answer, right? But other than that, feel free to ask any questions that you may have. Yes. Okay. So, while I wait for your questions, I'm just going to share a little bit more on why I think it is so important to share my knowledge and experience of worm castings. And I'm just going to tell you in the form of a story of my experience. So, remember how I told you that why I got started in worm farming was because it was taking too long for the compost to be ready. I had to wait 1 year, and for all of the warmer months, I had to be turning compost twice per week, every single week. Frustrating and tiring. I like doing it, but I was too tired after working full time to be doing that every twice per week. So anyway, 1 year as I was looking after my garden, I started to notice little creatures in my garden that I've never seen before. I was wondering, what are these creatures? They look like little flies, and they have some form of metallic color to them, but I've never seen them before. But I don't like to kill things if I don't have a good reason to do so. And so I decided I was going to just let them stay. And after a while, I decided, you know what, I need to find out what these creatures are, especially since I started to notice I was observing them for a few weeks and I saw nothing happening. So I figured they were okay. But as time goes by, I notice that the leaves of my plants start to curl down and the plants are not growing as much as they should. And I'm questioning what's happening here. But the only thing that was different in my garden was the presence of these creatures. So after doing some research, I found out that they were leaf hoppers. And by the time I realized that most of my plants were already damaged. And so after doing my research, I found out that once you have leaf hoppers damaging your plants are going to be stunted. They can produce, but if they produce, even what they produce are going to be stunted as well. So I decided, okay, you know what? Let me test my worm castings and see if it will help. And so I made a batch of worm tea, and every time I go out and I spray the plants with it and I water the garden with the worm tea. Now, you should know when leaf hoppers damages your plants, it is irreversible no matter what you do. But anyway, I decided I was going to test the worm tea and I started to see the plants looking up. They never recovered fully, but based on how the plants look, I wasn't really expecting much of an harvest. But every week I would treat the plants with the worm tea and I keep watering and using it as a foliar spray. And then I noticed something. The plants start to improve and looking a little bit livelier. And I was able to get a nice harvest that year. Not like what I got the previous years or the other years before, but because I was using the worm tea, it was strengthening the plant so that it can fight back a little, not fully because the damage was already done, but it was able to strengthen the plant enough that I was able to have a nice harvest from it. And so I realized that worm tea is definitely worth it. Worm casting, worm farming is definitely worth it. And so as I see this, I start to think to myself, people need to learn about worm farming because it can help them to avoid so much of the stress. Not to mention, you don't have to rely on the harmful chemicals anymore for pesticide. You don't have to rely on the harmful fertilizers and things like that. So now I cannot see myself without having a worm farm. In fact, I take it so seriously that now, you know how they tell you climatic condition is so bad that you must have a go bag. You want to know what is in my go bag? Yep. Yes, right beside my go bag, I have my little bin with worm cocoons in there. And I switch these out quite often because the cocoons are going to hatch and the worms are going to grow and all of that. So I switch these out quite often to ensure that they're viable. But I have them there because I can't see myself after all that benefit, all that worm castings and worm farming has done for me. I cannot see myself without worms. So when I have my go bags right there beside my go bag, there is a container with a few worms and worm cocoons in there just to ensure that wherever I go, I have my worms there with me and I don't have to start entirely from scratch. Because let's face it, true worm farming has become a lot more popular. In my day, in 2016, when I first started, I searched for information on worm farming so often and there was hardly any information to be found. Hardly any information. And when you find information, it's usually people just showing their worm farm, but not really teaching you anything. It's like people were hoarding the information for themselves. And so I started sharing what I'm learning about my worms. I started doing experiments with my worms. And now more and more people are sharing their information too, and it is becoming a big thing. More and more people are learning about worm farming, but you know what? There are still so many people who don't know. They don't know about worm farming. Some don't even know what worm casting is and don't know about the benefits of it. And if we would only just spend the time to share what we know, so many people could have so much better results. And when you hoard information like these, it's not hurting just those you're holding it back from. You're hurting yourself as well. Why would I say that? Think about this. One of the benefits of worm casting is that it reduces waste at the landfill. It reduces our dependence on chemical pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers, doesn't it? Now, if you hold back the information that you have from people because you don't want to share it, you don't want them to be on the same level as you don't want them to reap the same benefit as you. If your neighbor beside you there is using chemical fertilizers and you are not, can you say you're growing organic food? Absolutely not, because whatever is on your neighbor's property, it is leaching onto your property. Every time more food goes to the landfill, it is creating a worse environment for you and your family. So therefore, we can't hold back information. When we hold back information, we are hurting ourselves. And that is why I created this group, this community that I'm encouraging you to join, where we share information because we want everybody to be able to grow their own food. We want people to be happy because when people are happy, they make you happy. When people are happy, they share. When people are happy, there are less theft, less crime and violence because their needs are being met. Most people are mean and criminals because their needs are not being met and they're not content. So when we do whatever we can to help those around us to reach, to fulfill their needs, then that helps them and it helps us. So that is why I create this community, because not only will I be sharing what I'm learning, my experiences, or but also when I'm going to be walking you through step by step. So for example, if you start your worm bin and you did the course and you don't remember what to do, or you come upon a new situation that you've never dealt with before and you don't know how to handle it, I will have live presentation where I'm showing you the steps. So say for example, this week you decided, okay, I'm going to buy one of White Davy's Eco Farmer worm bin and get started, but I don't know the steps. You can come into this community. There will be resources there. Some will be live, some won't be live. They will be in the video format, but you can come and you can find the resources. And if you have questions, you can ask your question. And if you join my community, please do not bash someone for their questions. We are not here to bash others. We're here to help each other grow. That is our purpose. That is the only reason why WD Worms and Garden exist, so that we can all thrive together. There's no other reason. If it's not serving that purpose, I might as well terminate it. So if you join my community, please do not bash anyone. Anyone found guilty of bashing others for their questions or their comments, you can't stay in the community. I'm sorry. So we are going to ensure that step by step you get the information that you need to ensure that you can succeed in your gardening and your worm farming endeavors. So I'm going to be leaving the link down in the description and you can sign up and become a part of this community. And we look forward to having you. Now, if you have any questions, I'm still looking for those questions, but I guess you guys don't have any questions. Okay, that is fine. So guys, I apologize again that we had such a late start because of technical difficulties. A lot of you had to leave because we have gone over the allotted time because of the late start, but we are so thankful that you were able to join us. If you have any question, please feel free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to answer your questions. So thank you again for being here. Thank you for your patience. And I hope you will have yourself a wonderful day. Now, I am going to be adding the link for our community to the chat. And it is called Worms and Garden Beyond Basics, because we go beyond basic information. Now, this community is fairly new, so there isn't a lot of content yet, but each week we'll be adding all sorts of content, whether in the form of post, video. Once per month, we're going to be going live. And if there is any topic that you would like me to discuss in depth, you can make your suggestions, because I'll be happy to share whatever information I know with you. We'll be having courses, we'll be having workshops, anything that will help both of us to grow, I will be sharing. So feel free to join the community, and I look forward to welcoming you to the WD Worms and Garden family. Okay, let's see. Do I have that right there? Okay, missing. Okay, here is the link if you want to join our community. Okay, so still no questions, right? Oh, Healthy, you said you like the content on your message. Okay, thank you very much, Healthy. So thank you guys for being here, and I hope to see you soon. Have a good day.